The snow fell in heavy, relentless waves, blanketing the empty road in a frozen silence. The only sign of life was the faint glow of a car's red taillights disappearing into the distance, swallowed by the night. Standing in the middle of the icy road, a lone German shepherd watched the vehicle vanish, his breath coming out in soft clouds. His fur was matted with dirt, his ribs visible beneath his skin. He had known hunger, he had known loneliness, but tonight something felt different. Before him, a battered cardboard box sat motionless on the asphalt, its edges damp from the melting snow. It had no business being there, alone in the cold. The dog, who had once been called Orson, in a life he could barely remember, tilted his head, ears pricked forward. Then the box moved, a faint rustling sound, barely audible over the wind. Orson's muscles tensed. His instincts screamed at him, "Move away, this is not your concern." But something in the air, something warm, something alive, held him there. Then a sound, a whimper, weak, fragile, almost lost to the storm. Orson stepped closer, his paws crunching against the ice. His breath was shallow now, his heart pounding in his chest. Carefully, he pressed his nose against the opening of the box. The scent that met him was faint, but unmistakable. It was the scent of a human, a small human, a baby. The realization sent a jolt through his body. His instincts shifted in an instant, from uncertainty to protection. The baby inside barely stirred. Its breath was shallow, its skin pale from the cold. If Orson didn't act now, there would be no second chances. Without hesitation, he clamped his teeth onto the edge of the box and began to drag it. His muscles strained, his paws slipping against the ice. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The storm howled around him, the snow falling heavier by the second. The road stretched endlessly ahead. But Orson pressed forward, driven by something he didn't fully understand. For the first time in a long time, he had a purpose, and he would not fail. Orson's jaws ached from gripping the damp, crumbling cardboard, but he didn't dare let go. The weight of the box dragged heavily against the snow, resisting every pull. His paws stung from the icy ground. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he pressed forward with every ounce of strength he had left. Inside the box, the baby was frighteningly still. He could hear no cries, no rustling, only the howling wind that seemed to swallow everything around them. Panic surged through him. He needed to move faster. The storm had grown merciless, thick flakes swirling in chaotic patterns, obscuring the road ahead. Each step was a battle, his legs trembling under the strain of exhaustion and cold. He had spent months wandering the streets, learning to survive. But this was different. The weight of responsibility was unlike anything he had ever known. The baby's scent was weaker now, nearly buried beneath the biting chill of the winter air. Was he already too late? A distant glow flickered through the snowfall. A street lamp, dim and hazy in the storm. Orson's chest heaved as a spark of hope ignited in his weary limbs. Light meant warmth. Light meant people. If he could just reach it, maybe, just maybe, someone would help. But doubt gnawed at him. Humans had never stopped for him before. They had passed him by when he was starving, shivering, abandoned. Would they even notice him now? Then a sound so faint he almost missed it. A whimper, softer than a breath, barely audible over the relentless wind. Orson froze. His ears twitched. The baby was still alive. But for how much longer? He lowered his head, nudging the side of the box with his cold nose. No response. No movement. A deep, desperate growl built in his throat. He could not let this little life slip away. Not after everything. Summoning what little energy remained in his failing body, Orson tightened his grip on the box and forced himself forward. Every step felt heavier than the last, his limbs screaming for rest, his vision blurring at the edges. The street lamp was closer now. He could hear distant sounds, cars, voices, the muffled hum of life beyond the storm. He let out a bark, hoarse, weak, desperate. But the wind devoured his voice, and the world around him remained indifferent. His legs wobbled, his body swayed, He had nothing left to give. Just as his knees buckled beneath him, his vision spinning into darkness, a new sound reached his ears. Footsteps, slow, cautious, crunching through the snow. A shadow emerged through the storm. A man, bundled in a thick coat, pausing mid-step, his eyes locked onto the bizarre sight before him. A stray dog, half buried in snow, clinging to a battered box with frozen jaws. Their gazes met, and in that single moment Orson knew this was his last chance. The man stood frozen in place, his breath visible in the cold night air. His gloved hands tightened into fists as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A stray German shepherd, battered by the storm, gripping a half-collapsed cardboard box between its teeth. The dog's body trembled, its fur matted with ice. Yet there was something in its eyes, something desperate, urgent. Orson could barely stand. His legs quivered, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The man was his only hope. With the last shred of strength left in him, he released the box, letting it drop onto the snow with a dull thud, and let out a bark hoarse, pleading, broken. His tail was stiff with cold, his ears pressed back against his head, but he refused to look away. He had to make the man understand. Hesitation flickered across the stranger's face. The dog was filthy, clearly astray, but something gnawed at him. Why was this animal protecting a box? And why had it dragged it all the way here, against the brutal force of the storm? A strange, twisting feeling settled in his gut. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step closer. Orson didn't move. He could feel the exhaustion creeping over him like a wave, dragging him downward, pulling him toward unconsciousness. But he held on. The man was reaching for the box now. If Orson had the strength, he would have barked again, would have told him to hurry. The moment the man knelt and pulled back the damp flaps of the cardboard, his entire body stiffened. His breath caught in his throat. The dim glow of the street lamp cast just enough light inside for him to see the small, shivering bundle within. A tiny face, pale and motionless, lips slightly parted, breath barely there. For a split second, the world around them seemed to stop. No wind, no sound, just the weight of realization crushing down on the man's chest. His mind raced. Oh God, it's a baby, a real living baby. Suddenly, instinct kicked in. His hands, trembling from something far beyond the cold, reached inside the box, feeling the frail warmth of the child's body against his fingers. Too cold, too still. He ripped off his gloves, wrapping them around the baby's small form, bringing it close to his chest. His heart pounded. He had no idea how long it had been out here, no idea if he was already too late. Orson watched, his head swaying from exhaustion. He had done all he could. It was up to the man now. Fumbling with his coat, the stranger pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed with numb fingers. "This is Officer Silas Boone," he said, his voice barely steady. I have an abandoned infant, unresponsive. I need an ambulance now." He barely heard the dispatcher's response. His eyes flicked back to the dog. Orson, who was still watching him, still holding on despite the way his body was swaying in the wind. Silas realized, with a lump forming in his throat, that if it hadn't been for this dog, the baby would already be dead. And maybe, just maybe, Orson would be next. Silas Boone clutched the baby tightly against his chest, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The infant's body was far too cold, frighteningly cold. He could barely feel the rise and fall of its breath. Panic coiled around his ribs, squeezing tight. He had been a cop for years. He had seen wrecks, fires, crimes that would haunt him for a lifetime. But never, not once, had he held life so fragile in his own hands. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, barely cutting through the chaos in his mind. "An ambulance is en route. Stay with me. What's the infant's condition?" Silas forced himself to respond, his breath uneven, cold, barely breathing. No visible injuries, but... His voice broke as he glanced down at the baby's tiny, unmoving hands. "Hurry!" Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the dog collapse. Orson's legs finally gave out beneath him, his body sinking into the snow like a puppet with its strings cut. His sides heaved, his breath shallow and uneven. The exhaustion, the hunger, the cold. It had all finally caught up to him. Silas's chest clenched. This dog, this incredible dog, had dragged the baby through the storm, through the freezing night, without a second thought for himself. And now, as the baby teetered on the edge of life, so did he. "Hang in there, buddy," Silas murmured, kneeling beside Orson while still cradling the infant. He hesitated for only a second before unzipping his coat wider, carefully shifting the baby against his chest for warmth. Then, with his free arm, he reached down and pulled the dog against him too, wrapping as much of his coat around them as possible. The German shepherd barely stirred. His body was limp, his breathing slow. Silas felt a sharp sting in his throat. "Don't you give up on me now," he whispered. "You got this baby here. I know you're not done fighting." The sirens came in the distance, barely piercing through the howling wind. Silas turned his head sharply. Two glowing headlights sliced through the dark as an ambulance skidded onto the icy road, tires crunching over frozen slush. The red and blue emergency lights flashed violently against the snow, casting eerie shadows over the scene. The paramedics burst from the vehicle, their boots sinking into the deep snow. "Over here!" Silas shouted, his voice raw. They sprinted toward him, eyes widening as they took in the sight. A shivering cop cradling a nearly lifeless infant and a half-frozen stray dog curled tightly against his side. "Baby first," one of them ordered, immediately taking the child from Silas's arms. Another paramedic knelt beside Orson, feeling for a pulse beneath the thick fur. Silas's breath hitched as he watched. The paramedic pressed a hand against the dog's ribs, frowning. "He's barely responsive," she muttered. Then louder, "We need to get both of them in now." Silas didn't hesitate. He shoved himself to his feet, his limbs stiff from the cold, and hoisted Orson's weak body into his arms. The dog didn't even have the strength to resist. His head lolled against Silas's chest, his breathing slow, dangerously slow. As he ran toward the ambulance, Silas glanced down at Orson's face. His eyes, barely open, still held that same unwavering loyalty. Even now, on the brink of death, he wasn't afraid. Silas swallowed hard. "You saved a life tonight, buddy. Now it's our turn to save yours." The ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing out the storm as the vehicle lurched forward. Inside, the air was thick with urgency, voices sharp, movements quick. Silas sat rigid on the cold metal bench, his hands trembling as he watched the paramedics work. The baby was wrapped tightly in heated blankets, an oxygen mask pressed against its tiny face. A heart monitor beeped faintly, its rhythm weak but steady. "He's hypothermic," one of the medics muttered. "But we got him just in time. If that dog hadn't found him..." His voice trailed off, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. The baby would have died. Silas swallowed hard, but his relief was short-lived. Across from him, Orson lay motionless on the gurney, his fur still damp, his body barely rising with each shallow breath. A paramedic knelt beside him, pressing a stethoscope to his chest. The deep furrow in her brow sent a cold spike of fear through Silas's spine. "How's he doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The medic exhaled sharply. "Not good." She gently lifted one of Orson's paws, pressing against the pads. "Severe exhaustion, hypothermia, dehydration. He hasn't eaten in days, maybe longer." She hesitated. "His body is shutting down." Silas felt his pulse hammer in his throat. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. "No, he's a fighter. He made it this far. You have to help him." The medic gave him a sad look. "We're doing everything we can, but his body is too weak. If he doesn't start responding soon..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Silas clenched his fists. He had just watched this dog drag himself through a snowstorm to save a life. He had refused to stop, refused to let go, even when his own body had been breaking. And now he was supposed to just fade away? No, not after everything. Silas reached out, resting a hand on Orson's head. The dog's fur was rough, tangled with ice, but still warm. Barely. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "You're not done yet." The ambulance jolted as it turned sharply, sirens wailing. The baby's monitor continued its slow, steady beeping. But Orson remained still. For the first time that night, Silas realized he had no idea if they would make it in time. The ambulance sped through the icy streets, its sirens wailing like a desperate cry against the howling wind. Inside, the tension was suffocating. The baby's weak heartbeat echoed through the monitor in slow, uncertain beeps. But Silas could barely focus on that now. His eyes were locked on Orson, who still hadn't moved. The paramedic worked quickly, wrapping heating pads around the dog's frail body, monitoring his shallow breathing. "He's slipping," she muttered, adjusting in 4 lines she had just inserted into his front leg. "We need to get his body temperature up, or we're going to lose him." Silas felt a lump rise in his throat. His fingers curled tighter around Orson's damp fur, as if holding onto him would somehow keep him tethered to this world. "You hear that, buddy?" he murmured. "They're trying to help you, but you gotta fight. You hear me? You have to fight." The German shepherd remained lifeless. Silas gritted his teeth. He had seen death before, too many times. He had lost partners, friends, good people who didn't deserve the endings they got. But this, watching a dog who had just saved a life fade away like this, felt wrong. The paramedic pressed her fingers against Orson's throat, searching for a pulse. Silas held his breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, she cursed under her breath. His heartbeat's irregular. "We're losing him." Silas's stomach clenched. No, not now." Without thinking, he leaned in, pressing his forehead gently against Orson's. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered, his voice barely steady. "You didn't drag that baby through a goddamn snowstorm just to give up now. You don't get to give up now." The dog's ears barely twitched. But then, so faint that Silas almost didn't believe it, Orson let out a breath. Weak, shaky, but there. The paramedic's eyes widened. "Wait, hold on." She pressed the stethoscope against his chest again. A pause. Then, relief. "He's stabilizing. It's weak, but he's still with us." Silas closed his eyes for half a second, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hand never left Orson's head. "That's it, buddy," he murmured. "That's it." The ambulance jerked as it came to a stop. The back doors flew open, flooding the space with hospital lights. Doctors and nurses were already waiting. The baby was rushed out first, disappearing into the chaos. But Silas stayed behind, helping lift Orson off the gurney. As they wheeled him inside, a single thought echoed in Silas's mind. He saved a life tonight. Now it's our turn to save his. The emergency room was a blur of movement. Doctors shouting, machines beeping, the air thick with urgency. Silas walked alongside the stretcher, his boots leaving wet imprints on the white hospital floor. His breath was still heavy, his pulse still hammering from the adrenaline. The baby had already been rushed into intensive care, and now Orson was being wheeled down another hallway, his body limp beneath the tangle of wires and blankets wrapped around him. A nurse turned to Silas as they pushed through the doors. "Are you the owner?" she asked, her voice brisk but not unkind. Silas hesitated. The question shouldn't have hit him as hard as it did. Was he? He had only met Orson that night, just hours ago, in the middle of a storm. And yet, everything inside him screamed that he couldn't just walk away. "Yes," he said firmly, his throat tight. "Yes, I am." The nurse nodded, scribbling something onto a clipboard. "Then you need to wait here." She gestured toward a row of plastic chairs outside the exam room. "We'll do everything we can, but he's in bad shape. If he makes it through the next few hours, he has a chance." Silas swallowed hard, watching as the doors swung shut behind Orson's stretcher. The word echoed in his head, gnawing at him. He had seen enough in his years on the force to know how fragile that word was. He sank into one of the chairs, rubbing a hand over his face. He hadn't even realized how cold he still was, how the dampness of his coat clung to his skin. But none of it mattered. All he could do was wait. Minutes passed, then an hour. At some point, a nurse approached, giving him an update on the baby, still weak, still critical, but stable. The doctors were hopeful. Silas let out a slow breath, nodding. That was something. That was hope. But there was no news about Orson. He stared at the floor, his knee bouncing restlessly. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something too clean, too artificial. It made him feel out of place, powerless. He was used to doing something, to having control. But here all he could do was sit, and wait, and hope. The doors to the exam room opened, and a vet in blue scrubs stepped out, pulling off a pair of gloves. Silas was on his feet in an instant. Is he? His voice caught. He cleared his throat, trying again. Is he okay? The vet exhaled, glancing down at her clipboard. He's still unconscious, but he's holding on. His body temperature is stabilizing and we've got him on fluids. The next few hours are crucial. Silas clenched his jaw. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it wasn't the worst one either. Can I see him? He asked. The vet hesitated, then nodded. Just for a minute. She led him through the doors, past rows of kennels and medical equipment, until they reached a quiet corner of the room. There, curled beneath a thick blanket, hooked up to N4, lay Orson. His breathing was shallow but steady. His fur, still damp, had been carefully cleaned in places where ice and dirt had clung too tightly. He looked small, smaller than he had out in the storm, where his determination had made him seem unbreakable. Silas crouched beside him, resting a hand on his head. The fur was warm now. That had to be a good sign. Hey, buddy, he murmured. You're not done yet. You hear me? Orson didn't stir. But for the first time since they'd found him, his tail gave the faintest twitch. Silas let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for hours. Maybe, just maybe, he was gonna make it. The steady beep of the monitors was the only sound in the dimly lit recovery room. Silas sat on the cold tile floor beside Orson's cot, exhaustion weighing heavily on his body. It had been hours since they arrived, and despite the warmth of the hospital, he still felt frozen. His fingers stiff, his chest tight. He had seen people fight for their lives before, but watching him fight, it was different. Orson lay still, his ribs barely rising and falling beneath the thick blanket covering him. The 4-drip fed warm fluids into his frail body, keeping him tethered to life. His fur, once damp and tangled with ice, had dried in uneven patches where the hospital staff had cleaned him. His ears remained limp, his paws stretched out, unmoving. But he was alive, for now. A soft knock at the door pulled Silas from his thoughts. He turned to see a nurse step inside, a clipboard tucked against her chest. "You're still here?" she asked, though there was no judgment in her voice, just quiet understanding. Silas nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, I didn't want him to wake up alone." His voice was hoarse, weighed down by the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the bones. The nurse gave him a small, tired smile. "Well, it's a good thing you stayed." She glanced at Orson. "Dogs in his condition don't usually make it this far without something to fight for. Having someone here helps." Silas looked down at Orson again, his throat tightening. But does he even have anything left to fight for? As if in answer, the German shepherd let out the faintest breath. So soft, so subtle, that Silas almost missed it. But then his paw twitched, just barely. The movement sent a jolt through Silas's chest. "Orson." His voice was quiet, hesitant. He leaned forward, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "Come on, buddy. You can do this." For a moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, painfully, Orson's eyelids fluttered. Just a crack. Just enough for Silas to see the dull brown of his gaze, unfocused and heavy with exhaustion. His breathing hitched, and Silas swore he saw the faintest flicker of recognition. The nurse let out a small breath of relief. "That's a good sign." Silas swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "Yeah," he murmured. "Yeah, it is." Orson's eyes slipped shut again. But this time, Silas wasn't afraid. because for the first time since the storm, there was hope. The following days were a blur of slow recovery. Orson remained weak, his movements sluggish, his body still fighting to mend itself after the brutal night in the storm. But he was alive. That was more than Silas had dared to hope for. Each morning, he arrived at the clinic before sunrise, bringing a cup of cheap hospital coffee for himself and a quiet presence for Orson. The dog still couldn't stand on his own, but he had begun to lift his head, his eyes clearer with each passing day. Every small improvement, every flicker of his ears, every slow blink, felt like a victory. The baby, too, had survived. Silas had checked in with the hospital staff regularly, his heart pounding each time he asked for an update. The little boy, whom the nurses had started calling Noah, was growing stronger, his tiny body no longer battling the cruel grasp of the cold. But the mystery of his past remained. No parents had come forward. No missing child reports matched his description. He had been left to die, and the only reason he hadn't was Orson. One evening, as Silas sat in the chair beside Orson's cot, the dog let out a soft sigh. His paw twitched against the blanket, and when Silas reached out, Orson shifted just enough to press his head against his hand. It was the first time he had actively sought comfort. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. "You did good, buddy," he murmured. "Real damn good." Orson's tail thumped once against the cot, weak but steady. For the first time since that night in the snow, Silas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. But then, the nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Officer Boone?" Silas looked up. "Yeah." She hesitated, glancing at Orson before meeting his eyes. "There's something you should know. About the baby." A chill ran through him. He sat up straighter, his fingers instinctively curling against Orson's fur. "What is it?" She shifted uncomfortably. "A woman came in today. She claims to be his mother." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Silas felt his jaw tighten. For days, that baby had been unwanted, abandoned, left to die. And now, someone wanted him back? Orson let out a soft breath, as if sensing the shift in the air. Silas's pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent so much time thinking about saving them, keeping them safe. But now, for the first time, a new thought entered his mind. What if saving them meant letting go? Silas stood outside the hospital's administrative office, staring through the glass window at the woman inside. She was young, barely in her 20s, her clothes wrinkled, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. She didn't look cruel. She didn't look like someone who would abandon a child in the snow. But Silas had learned a long time ago that desperation could make people do terrible things. When he finally stepped inside, she flinched at his presence. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "His name isn't Noah," she whispered. "It's Eli." Her eyes filled with tears as she explained how she had been homeless, how she had no family, how she had left him near the road hoping someone kind would find him before it was too late. "I didn't know a storm was coming," she choked out. "I never wanted to hurt him." Silas listened, his fists clenched at his sides. He had wanted to hate her. He had wanted to tell her she didn't deserve to call herself his mother. But the truth was, she wasn't a monster, just a broken person who had run out of choices. And because of that, Eli had almost died. If it weren't for Orson, Silas swallowed hard, unable to finish the thought. Later, he sat beside Orson's cot at the clinic, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. "Does she deserve another chance?" Orson, still weak but stronger than before, simply rested his paw on Silas's knee. A silent answer. Silas let out a slow breath, nodding. "Yeah," he murmured. "I thought so too." A week later, Silas watched from the hospital doors as Eli's mother held him in her arms again, sobbing softly into his tiny shoulder. She wasn't alone anymore. Social services had stepped in, offering her a chance to rebuild her life. Eli would have a home, a future, and as Silas looked down at Orson, now standing beside him, he realized something. So would they. He reached down, scratching behind the German shepherd's ears. "Come on, partner," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in days. "Let's go home." And this time Orson followed, not as a stray, not as a survivor, but as family.